Welcome to Happiness in the City. This is Barbara, and today I'd like to talk about a concept of joy. We have a lot of difficulties today in the world because of lack of love. And we are trying to reach love, but you cannot really get to love if you are furious and you are angry and you are filled with rage and mockery and all of the negative emotions. So when a person is going through such hatred, if hatred comes from outside as remedy, there is simply more hatred, joint hatred, and it is a spiral into devastation and complete nothingness in terms of ability to create human relationships. When we approach hatred with love, as God does, He applies His loving touch and grace to things that are lacking love. Then there is hope that through that grace, love will overpower hatred and will end up with more love. And then, of course, when you connect love to love, there's more love, there's more connection that brings amazing sense and expectation of goodness. And at the highest level, this is what the highest kind of joy is. It is joy that is connected to love. God is love. God is love also as authority that is running Kingdom of God. So we have to start looking at that concept of joy also in the context of authority. Because if God is love and He is the authority that created the universe and created us, and He's running Kingdom of God, then why should we not emulate this in power and authority situations? Why yield to hatred and rage and hopelessness? So one of the things that I'm so grateful to America for is that I was very lucky to attend MIT and then to be able to take lots of courses in political philosophy at Harvard University. And that political philosophy was grounded in traditional education of politics. And that tradition of that kind of education of politics always stressed the standard of divine love as standard for authority. Some people decided to not be focusing on that, and they created the concept of political science, and they assume that science is separated from love. But in fact, when you study traditional political philosophy, science is included in this. I was born in Sopot, Gdansk, Danzig. That is a place that is not very far from where the great Nicola Copernicus worked, and he discovered amazing things in astronomy. He's the one who discovered that the Earth is going around the sun, not the sun around the earth. He discovered many other things, and he was also a multidimensional scholar. He was educated in many disciplines that were then taught by the Roman Catholic Church, and the tradition in Roman Catholic Church came from Roman Empire. Some of it came from Israel, an Israeli tradition of Bible studies and being greatly versed in the words of God, but a lot of educational tradition that came to Europe was continuation of great education in Roman Empire. I have one of my favorite Roman emperors, Marcus Aurelius, who wrote books, and he understood the need to connect authority, even at the highest earthly levels, to learning and science and knowledge and wisdom. So Harvard University continued that tradition of high privilege given to knowledge of ancient philosophers and modern philosophers. I have to still believe that they are doing it as continuation of tradition. But in the 90s, they definitely had that great tradition. And that education transformed my mind. That education gave me alternative to any temptations of ideological thinking in politics. Because ideologies are loveless. They are grounded on certain ideas that exclude other ideas from consideration. They are ideas that limit understanding of human relationships to just a few principles, whereas love is limitless by definition. Divine love is without bounds. It's unlimited because God is unlimited and God is the source of love. So when we are talking today about the need to create antidotes to hate speech, we cannot create more hate speech and banning and condemnation as a solution to it, because it will just continue spiraling into creation of more hate speech, and then at the end there is always violence. So I think that we have to return to that connection between joy, love, and then to understand that they are connected also to the concept of beauty in authority. Beauty meaning ability to perceive kingdom of God through presence of divine beauty in our lives. That means that we understand that beauty comes from kingdom of God. It's not human concept, it is human ability to perceive it that God gave us because we are all in the image of God. The Wikipedia encyclopedia begins the article on joy by saying that the word joy means a feeling of great pleasure and happiness. So this is one way to understand it. I believe that joy is not only pleasure and happiness, but also connecting and grasping divine love. And sometimes it's not a feeling when you grasp divine love, it's more a state of being. When God gave me the miraculous healing in 1998, I experienced this, and this is something that cannot be explained in words. I understand Thomas Aquinas when, after years and years of writing his amazing books, he had divine vision and stopped writing because his comment was that in comparison to what he experienced through God giving him that access to divine vision, that everything he had written before was but a straw, and he felt he didn't know how to put that divine vision into words. But he left a testimony that divine vision, as a grace of God, is credible. God can choose some people to experience it. So my role model when I was growing up was Nicholas Copernicus. We would visit Framberg, where he used to work. We studied a lot about this great man. So when I got to Massachusetts Institute of Technology, I continued that love of learning that was imparted to my life since I was a little girl. And that was the standard. Nicholas Copernicus, as a man who is directly communicating with God and capable of defying authorities around him. In this case, it was authority of the church, because the Polish king actually liked those ideas because they were strengthening his power and his prestige as king of Poland. So eventually the church understood its error, and there was reconciliation. But one of the things that I learned through that experience of being aware of that triangle between individuals who are thriving in search for God's love and knowledge, and authorities that haven't caught up with that yet. And it taught me one thing, that we need to be peaceful in the way political arrangements exist, but there always has to be spirit of liberty and room for people like Nicholas Copernicus and other people of that love of learning, so that we allow God to bring us closer and closer to the joy of knowing truth through his revelation and science. So science and authority of love are connected. They are diverse dimensions in the way authority functions, but true science is a form of authority because it teaches us the principles according to which God created us and created the universe. So I think that when we understand in politics, in social media, that we need to focus on that need to bring joy to communications and to diminish the hateful responses to hate. And it's not easy. I understand perfectly well how you feel when someone comes up to you and says an insult. It's not easy to create a shield of love that would be able to create so much presence of divine love that that kind of hatred loses power and authority. So the conflict is between power and authority of God and divine love, and power and authority of hate and hopelessness. When we understand the level at which this takes place, then we'll not waste time to create more hatred as response to hatred. We'll create opportunities to access the learning that is our heritage, but also new knowledge that God continues to reveal. Like we experienced His revelation in internet. Previous generations had no knowledge and no experience of something as magnificent as this international worldwide form of communication. And that created new opportunities for people to form relationships. And we need to focus on bringing that divine love to this new technology so that we are in the glorious presence of learning, like Nicholas Copernicus was in the presence of glorious teacher that in his case was Jesus Christ himself. So I think that when we understand that joy is important, joy, happiness, pleasure are important, but they shouldn't be achieved by creating hatred as antidote to hatred, but as alternatives to hatred. And when we know that when somebody insults us and we create opportunities for redemption, opportunities to open up better channels of communication or to create understanding that would end up in transformation of the relationship into loving, friendly relationship, it is worth it, because then it creates more powerful connections, it creates more life, and it brings God into conversations that otherwise would be empty of divine light and divine presence. So I wanted to share with you this experience from Harvard University from early 90s, and I told you in some other times that's where I got my vision of what today is called Facebook, diverse pages communicating with each other, though they are not directly connected to each other. And that image, that vision was picked up later on by Mark Zuckerberg, but that vision came to me when I was studying Plato, when I was focusing primarily at that time on Plato's Statesman. So the love of learning from Roman Empire came directly to my heart through Harvard University, and now it became a loving presence in the entire world. That's why the world loves Facebook. It's not about some ways in which a few people would use it for their purposes that are more partisan than shared value of mankind's affection to each other. But nevertheless, those minor things should not be used to diminish the glorious technology that God allowed us to experience, and that comes from the deep roots of how ancient teachers of philosophy wanted to experience learning directly from God, but also with these students, and how to teach these students how to become great teachers. So we have to come back to understanding that joy is so powerful and so important that it shouldn't be allowed to be destroyed by hatred. There's a wonderful quote from C.S. Lewis, who actually wrote that in his understanding, joy, pleasure, and happiness were three different things. It's just another way of looking at it. And he wrote, I quote, "I sometimes wonder whether our pleasures are not substitute for joy, and I call it joy, which is here a technical term and must be sharply distinguished both from happiness and pleasure. Joy in my sense has indeed one characteristic and one only in common with them: the fact that anyone who has experienced it wants it again. I doubt whether anyone who has tasted it would ever, if both were in his power, exchange it for all the pleasures in the world. But then joy is never in our power, and pleasure often is." And this is a very interesting distinction that helped me understand the way in which pleasure is connected to joy, joy is connected to pleasure and happiness, but we cannot control joy in the same way as we would control pleasure. It's a good point. And when a person is devoid of true joy in the heart that comes from God, that pleasure becomes a substitute if it is connected to hate. And that is a very dangerous situation, because then some would derive pleasure from bringing more hate to the world. And then they would be dealing with responses to the hatred by more pleasure that is connected to the opposing side's hate. And a lot of what is happening today is exactly that. There's this circle of diverse people with hatred to each other or to their ideas, and they derive pleasure from having power over attacking their opponents. That is not joy in the sense of divine joy. It is true divine joy that comes higher than hatred and connects our hearts to divine love. So when we understand that true pleasure that is connected with joy does not have to have our control over it, because it's already controlled by divine will and divine power, then we'll not have to intend to destroy someone else's lives or ideas, because that would not bring us any pleasure at all. So in closing, I wanted to come back to the idea of nobility. Nobility is a state of being, an attitude in social relationships that is connected to beauty that comes from divine love, divine joy, divine will. And nobility applies beauty to social relationships in ways that bring it pleasure when it develops relationships based on love, based on friendship, good social attitudes. And when we understand that nobility would never derive pleasure from harming another person, then we know that we are creating foundations for social communications that leave space and time for truly loving relationships and for great friendships and good neighborly speech. That is my answer to hate speech. The term hate speech is very misleading because it is hate, but it only thinks of penalties in the form of more hate from a different level, different authority. It doesn't include remedy of loving speech, and that can only come from God and our responsiveness to divine love. Thank you so much for listening to my remarks today, and see you here next week for another edition of Happiness in the City with Barbara.